Good morning. It's good to be back with you, and I'm excited to be finishing off the second half of 2 Corinthians chapter 11 here, and I'm going to open us up with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Lord, thank you for allowing me to be here today. Thank you for giving me the allowing me to teach Sunday school here. Lord, please give me the words to say, give me the insight, help me to communicate it clearly, Lord, and amen. Okay, so last week we covered verses 1 through 12, and Vines called it, part of what Vines' kind of point was there was what Paul said in verse 2, which is what he called godly jealousy. And he went through and we discussed a lot of points around that and kind of that idea of being concerned. Paul was concerned for the church that they would fall away from Christ. And then also he had this issue of he's had the false teachers, the Judaizers that are in the church in Corinth that he's trying to defend himself against, but he's torn with this idea of he's going to have to remind the church what he had accomplished and those sort of things. So we're going to dive deeper into that. We kind of stopped at the end of verse 12, which stopped just short of him starting to address those false teachers. But this week, the title in Vines' lesson was our gravitation towards ungodly jealousy. And when we think about jealousy as a sin, it's not something you have to teach somebody, right? Like I have a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old, and I didn't have to teach them to be jealous of one another. All I have to do is give one of them something, and the other two will immediately want it. So it's a sin that we know from a very early age, and we commit very easily, and even as adults we can be guilty of it almost without knowing or get to that point and realize it after we've kind of committed it. So that's what Paul is going to be talking about here, and we'll roll through this pretty quick. But I'm gonna start with a verse in Matthew 7:15, where Jesus is addressing false prophets. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. So Paul, where we pick back up in 2 Corinthians, is kind of starting with a verse very similar to that one. He's going to be breaking down what the false prophets have done and some of the damaging things they've done to the church. So this is going to be 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 13. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. So the first thing he addresses there is he calls them false apostles. Apostle is a person that was appointed by Christ himself to go out and lead people to Christ. And these Judaizers were claiming to be apostles, but they were not. Secondly, they're doing what Paul calls deceitful works, or deceitful in their nature. So they're trying to trick the church into believing false teachings, telling the people what they want to hear so that they'll come to church but not necessarily be transformed by the gospel. They're not preaching the gospel, they're preaching a legalistic religion, a religion of legalism, so to speak. And we'll talk more about that in verse 20. And then finally, the second or the last little bit of this talks about them transforming themselves. And then it picks up in verse 14. No wonder, for Satan transformed himself into an angel of light. Therefore it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose ends will be according to their works. So Paul is saying, kind of explaining that last point of these false teachers, to take on a sheep and wolf's, or a wolf in sheep's clothing rather. He's saying Satan did the same thing many times. We shouldn't expect any different out of false teachers. And so there is a verse in John 8:44 that I was going to read. Now this is Jesus addressing some of the I don't know if it was Sadducees or Pharisees, but it was false teachers. You are of your father the devil, and the desires of your heart you want to do. He was murdered from the beginning and he was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth, because there is no truth in him. He speaks a lie. He speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. And that's the same verbiage or same rhetoric, so to speak, of that Paul's using, that false teachers are the children of Satan, or Satan is their father. So that's kind of Paul's addressing that point of beware of false prophets. Now I'm going to jump over into verse 16 here, and Paul, these first couple verses, Paul is very reluctant, is the word my Bible kind of has across the top there. He's reluctant to boast, and we get into the reason why he ends up boasting, and I'll explain why he's justified in that. But he's very reluctant because he feels like he's moving away from the way Jesus operated and the way Jesus presented himself, and he's putting himself. But there's a reason for it, and I'll explain that. So, starting here in verse 16, I say again, let no one think of me a fool. If otherwise, at least receive me as a fool, that I also may boast a little. So Paul is saying he's going to boast of his accomplishments, but he's also calling himself a fool, saying, trying to communicate he doesn't want to do this, but there's a reason late in the next couple verses. What I speak not according to the Lord, but as it were foolishly in the confidence of boasting. Seeing that many boast according to the flesh, I will also boast, for you put up with fools gladly, since you yourselves are wise. So what is occurring is the church in Corinth has placed a lot of value on people's works, and people come in and they brag about their works, and that's what the Judaizers are doing. And I'm going to read a verse from Proverbs 26:5. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. And what Paul says in 19, and what that verse in Proverbs basically says, is he's got to address that church in a way that they will understand. He's got to meet them where they are. Unfortunately, that requires him to do something that takes him out of his comfort zone. But that's what he does here. He even talks about back in 17. He's saying, I know that this letter is divinely inspired, but he feels a guilt or a reluctance about writing it in these terms. For you put up. Okay, so this is moving into, he's going to start talking about the Judaizers and what the church is putting up with and how they're damaging themselves. So, for you put up with it if one brings you into bondage, if one devours you, if one takes from you, if one exalts himself, if one strikes you in the face. So Paul's motives here for boasting is to help the church. The Judaizers are boasting to help themselves. Paul's motives are pure. The Judaizers are selfish. Paul now points out 5 things. First is bondage. What he's in reference to is this bondage of this religious legalism that the Judaizers were teaching. They were not teaching the gospel of Christ. They were focused on legalistic things that they wanted to bring into the church, and that served selfish reasons, nothing to do with eternal reasons. Secondly, he used the word devour. That's talking about their economic resources. The Judaizers' goal was to enrich themselves and remove resources from the church. And then he says, my Bible says takes from you. Some versions said take of you. But that is a picture of being tricked or being caught, a bird being caught in a snare. And that's what Paul's equating what the church is allowing these guys to do to them. And then he says, if one exalts himself, obviously that is, if a person's exalting themselves, they can't be exalting Christ. And this last one, I had to do a little more reading to understand exactly what this was, but between Wiersbe and Vines, some Bibles say smite themselves. My Bible says if one strikes you in the face. This was a form. It was not like an assault. It wouldn't be like if I walked up and hit someone and we got into a fight. This is a form of public embarrassment. And the Judaizers were doing this as a way to strike fear into the church members and to bring them in line. And if you think that this message doesn't apply to today, you need to post something on social media and see how quick you're going to get smite, in the Bible's terms, in the face, because that is the method now that people use aggressively, is to try and embarrass people who believe in Christ and not as much some of these other things, but that is a weapon that Satan is wielding today more than anything else. And I got a little off subject there, but in terms of thinking about how this message applies, be aware that false teachers don't necessarily come into our church today, but they're out there. They've got television, social media, the news. There's all sorts of other ways that we hear things about the gospel. In Paul's time, people were really not getting a lot of that outside of the church. Nowadays, we get it from a lot of different angles, and so we have to. Last week's lesson was a lot about, are we focused? Are we checking what people say versus the Bible, and using this as the key through prayer and reading our Bible to make sure what people say is right. And that's a big part of this lesson as well, is understanding that we have to continue. We have to do that as we keep going. Okay, so I'm a little off topic. I'm going to jump back here in verse 21. To our shame, I say that we were too weak for that, but in whatever anyone is bold, I speak foolishly, I am also bold. Now, Paul is using what I think Vines called a little inspired irony or sarcasm there, and saying, I'm using this to help you, church, but I'm doing it sarcastically, so to speak. He's saying, I'm going to try to do this as humble. And the church viewed Paul's, we talked about this a lot last week, the church at Corinth viewed Paul's humble and meekness as a weakness, and they viewed the Judaizers' arrogance as power. And Paul is trying to show them that is he is putting all the glory on God. The Judaizers are trying to remove that from God, and he's trying to get them back on the right path there. Okay, so starting in verse 22, Paul is going to kind of lay out the suffering that he has endured, and verse 28 is what he's really trying to get across to the church. But I'm going to read through this and talk a little bit about each verse as we go. And are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they seeds of Abraham? So am I. And what he's trying to say there is, church, their heritage is no different than my heritage. Don't let them fool you into thinking that somehow they're more qualified because of their heritage. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequently, in deaths often. What he's saying there is a little bit of the first part of the verse is a little more of inspired irony, but he's saying, are they ministers of Christ? And then he says, here are my stripes, so to speak, where are theirs? And so he then starts listing out the suffering that he has endured, and he's essentially contrasting that with the suffering that they have not endured. Okay, so picking up in verse 24. From the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and day I have often been in the deep. A night and day I have been in the deep. In journeys often in perils in journeys often, in perils of water, in perils of robbery, in perils of my own country, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren. In weariness and toils and sleeplessness often, in hunger, thirst, and fasting often, in cold and nakedness. So Paul tries to lay out all the sufferings that he has endured in his ministry. Now, one of the things, if you read we've seen it earlier in 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about his sufferings as something that he views as temporal, almost trivial. He views it as something that makes him stronger because it has brought him closer to Christ. And so he lays all that out, and then in verse 28 he says, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily. Now all of these sufferings, you can say Paul suffered these daily, but they don't all occur daily. But he said this last thing here that he lists is something that comes to him daily. My deep concern for all the churches. And that concern is basically what he's laid out in all of chapter 11, is that they will fall away from Christ. He's saying that is something that weighs on him. That's a stress and anxiety, a concern that hits him daily and drives him to pray for the church and ultimately drives him to write this letter to them. So that is the concern. He's trying to show them his love and try to get them to realize that them falling away is not okay. It's not something he's going to not fight for, which is what he talked about back in verse 12. Okay, so verse 29 here. And it's interesting the way Paul kind of ends this, because if you think about, he's boasted, but he hasn't boasted about anything but his suffering, which in worldly terms, people are not going to view suffering in a positive light, right? But he now, he hasn't really boasted on anything that a non-believer would boast on. But here we start in verse 29. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? If I boast, I will boast of things which concern my infirmity. What he's saying in verse 29 is he's reiterating that point I made of his infirmities, his sufferings are what makes him closer to God and brings him closer to God, and that's the only things he's willing to brag on or boast on is a better way to say it. And then these last three verses was something that was interesting to me. The God of our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. In Damascus, the governor under Artaxerxes, the king, was guarding the city of Damascus with his garrison, desiring to arrest me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in a wall and escaped from his hands. And I read that, the first couple times I read it, it felt slightly out of place. I wasn't sure what point Paul was trying to make, but after reading what Vines wrote and Wiersbe, I kind of come to the conclusion of what Paul's doing there is he's bringing up something that occurred in his life that he could take no credit for. Much the same way as David could take no credit for killing Goliath. He was a child that threw a stone and hit. If Saul, King Saul, not Paul Saul, if Saul had gone out there and killed Goliath, Saul would have gotten the credit for that. But David did it, and God received the credit for that because a child couldn't kill a giant. Paul is pointing out here something that he could not have the credit for. He had no control of getting out of that city, and God provided him a way. And so he's coming back in this last part of this chapter and trying to put God back first in front of the people and make sure that he is behind that. That he is behind God and he's taking none of the credit. So anyhow, that's all I've got there. I got a little off, run a few rabbits there, but I appreciate the time and y'all have a good week. Thank you.